The question is that the motion be agreed to. Raymond Ho.
Should the Minister who's responsible for this bill, the Honourable Maurice Williamson, have listened to the submitters to the Local Government and Environment Select Committee, he would not be standing there, Mr. Speaker, with respect, reading out his half-baked speech on his half-hearted bill, which falls well short of the reform required in the beauty industry. I outlined those views expressed by those submitters in my media statement released this afternoon. And I do agree with those submitters who correctly called on the government to withdraw the bill and bring it back to the House once a more comprehensive package of reforms is available. Labour opposes this bill. It appears that the Minister has presented two personas. The one I like, Mr. Speaker, is the Minister who was quoted in the media as complaining that leaky homes are still being built in his own electorate, to be precise. And I quote, "A dramatic overhaul of the Building Act is needed desperately to end the crisis," close quote. And there is another persona whose rhetoric is much powerful than the actual work he delivered. At a time when the building industry is under huge pressure with the Christchurch rebuild and leaky building remediation work and a huge-scale deficit all looming large, a comprehensive reform of the industry is required, not a bandit and piecemeal approach. What we need is genuine leadership to address the fundamental problems. It seems to resonate well with the warnings of professionals such as Mr. John Scarry and some of his colleagues that most leaky buildings had faulty designs, and structure engineering in New Zealand is about to become the first profession in the modern world that will cease to be a profession. Poor standards of construction and deficient building materials are the main contributing factors towards the collapse of the CTV building. Hollow core, slender concrete walls, brittle cold-worked welded wire mesh and deficient floor diaphragms are the main issues which applied to other at-risk buildings as well. It is appalling to read the New Zealand Herald reports that deregulation of the industry had allowed manufacturers to pay for the development of standards to justify their own products. Even according to Minister Maurice Williamson himself, which I touched upon earlier, that leaky homes are still being built and therefore a dramatic overhaul of the Building Act is needed desperately to end the crisis. However, this bill, together with the Building Amendment Bill number 4, are miles away from being a broad reform package. Rather, they are nothing but partial installments. Talking about the leadership, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to acknowledge the work and efforts made by other officials and thank members of the Select Committee, formal and current ones, for the work they have done. Particularly, I'd like to acknowledge Green and the Labour members who presented the minority report, which is necessary, meaningful, and responsible. I'd like to also acknowledge the O'Sullivan brothers who exposed the rotten timber crisis that has devastated our country. It is sad, shall I add, that many of us have been made aware that the multi-billion-dollar rotten timber disaster in housing is merely the tip of the iceberg. In the 1990s, New Zealanders moved away from traditional weatherboard and brick houses. Instead, builders began using flat, lightweight panels with a plaster finish to give a more Mediterranean look. Many builders say the leaky building problem goes back to the introduction of a new building code in 1991. Instead of telling architects and builders how to design and construct houses, it concentrated on results. The Han report in 2002 said it highlighted the problems that occurred when a performance-based code did not keep pace with rapidly changing building technology. Mr. Speaker, we do support and are in broad agreement with the direction of the Building Act review, which was initiated under the former Labour government. More importantly, we must ensure that we fully understand what went wrong in all instances, not to apportion blames, but to learn valuable lessons that will minimize the risk of failure in the future. To that end, Mr. Speaker, we need genuine leadership to address the fundamental problems. I read rather earnestly the open letter to the Institution of Professional Engineers by Mr. John Scarry in 2002. The letter, which had nearly 80 pages, exposed widespread and acceptable bad practices in the structural engineering profession and the construction industry in New Zealand. I acknowledge the contributions made by Mr. Scarry and his colleagues over the past years, seeking to work for positive reforms. I've learned a lot from that letter. Also, I've learned a lot from the two reports by Building Industry Authority and Institution of Professional Engineers, which examined what they called as significant design and construction issues arising out of a review of the Scarry open letter. The media reports offered some grim reading. Since the Scarry open letter, the Waitakere Trust Stadium was collapsing during erection. The stadium Southland, which was collapsing under its own weight in 1999 before repairs were made, collapsed in 2010 under a moderate snow load. Luckily on one of the few days of the year when the stadium was not full of people. The headline of the New Zealand Herald story on 22nd September 2010 says it all. Roof collapse raises building code fears. The news report went on to say that the Southland collapse came after design faults had to be fixed during the construction of Victor Arena and Waitakere Trust Stadium several years ago. Mr. Speaker, this bill includes only some parts of the reform agenda that has been widely discussed with the industry over the last few years. The bill attempts to shift responsibility and accountability away from building consent authorities towards builders and consumers. The role of these authorities is being reduced, but until there is more genuine reallocation of accountability, this bill risks exposing the consumer to greater risk by reducing the role of councils. We think it is risky and unwise to legislate such a piecemeal set of measures at a time when the industry is facing a surge in demand from the Christchurch rebuild and remediation, leaky building remediation work, a huge scale deficit and uncertainty about whether there will be sufficient builders entering the new licensing scheme. Mr. Speaker, we're not talking about statistics. We're talking about a problem that may have affected most housing, schools and museums, airports and seaports, government and commercial office space. We're talking about safety and we're talking about human lives.
Call Nikki Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this bill is about building